I walked into my daughter's living room, thinking it would be like any other Sunday. But the moment she opened her mouth, I knew nothing would ever be the same. "Mom," she said, her voice sharp, "we've made some new house rules. You just don't interfere." I froze. Interfere. After everything I'd done for this family, after all the years I'd supported them, loved them, and stood by their side. My heart sank, a mix of hurt and disbelief bubbling inside me, but I didn't say a word. I kept my calm. I smiled, nodded, and let her think she had the upper hand. Because I knew something she didn't. I knew that there are moments in life where silence can speak louder than words, where patience and observation can create a power no argument ever could. And as I stood there, listening to the list of new rules she hoped would keep me in my place, I began to quietly form a plan that wouldn't be loud, a plan that wouldn't cause a scene, but a plan that would ensure one thing. By the end of this, respect would be mine, whether she realized it yet or not. And that's when I understood. Sometimes the quietest actions leave the deepest mark. I remember the exact moment my world tilted sideways, the moment I realized my presence in my daughter's life had suddenly become negotiable. She sat across from me on that crisp Sunday morning, the sunlight spilling through the living room windows. She had that look, calm, collected, almost rehearsed, the look of someone delivering a verdict. My daughter, the girl I had raised, looked at me and said, "Mom, we've made some new house rules. You just don't interfere." I felt my chest tighten. Don't interfere? The words echoed in my mind like a slap I hadn't seen coming. After every birthday, every holiday, every scrape-deward knee, and every late-night call she had ever made, after every moment I had quietly poured my heart into this family, she was drawing a line. She was putting me outside of her world, defining my place with rules, boundaries, restrictions, and an unspoken judgment. I blinked and nodded. I smiled. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. But inside, I was stunned. Then she began to list the rules, each one striking me like a tiny, deliberate cut. Rule 1, no rearranging anything in the house. If it's my choice, it stays my choice. I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks, a flush of indignation I refused to voice. I had spent years helping set up this house, lending advice, offering suggestions, making it a warm, inviting home for my grandchildren, and now my hands were being metaphorically tied. Rule 2, no unsolicited advice, even if it's about chores, finances, or the kids. My lips pressed into a thin line. Unsolicited. After everything I had done, they were labeling my love as intrusion. My heart thumped painfully at this, hurt and disbelief blending into a sharp pang, but I remained composed. Rule 3, no interfering with family schedules or decisions. If you disagree, keep it to yourself. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the storm building in my chest. This wasn't just about rules, it was about control. My role, my voice, my experience, they wanted me quiet. They wanted me compliant. And yet, somehow, I could feel a quiet fire igniting inside me. As she continued, outlining the smaller rules, no staying late without prior notice, do not take the grandchildren out on your own, follow our guidelines exactly when helping around the house, I realized the magnitude of the shift. Every rule was a statement. You are welcome, only within limits we define. My presence was now conditional, framed by restrictions that made my heart ache. I took a deep breath, slowly, deliberately, as if each inhale was a reminder to myself, I am not powerless, I am not invisible, I am still here. I may be told where I can step, what I can say, and how I can act, but I am still a mother, and mothers. We don't disappear quietly. Not completely. There was hurt, yes, an unmistakable, raw hurt that weighed on my chest like stones. I thought about the hours spent driving to soccer games, the sleepless nights tending to colds and fevers, the countless times I stayed out of arguments to preserve peace, only to now be told that my involvement, my experience, my care was somehow unwelcome. It stung, deeply, and yet, within that sting, determination began to blossom. I realized that I had two choices. I could react in anger, in tears, in loud protest, and become a cautionary tale of bitterness, or I could remain calm, observe, and quietly plan. I could let my dignity remain intact while letting my actions, when the moment came, speak louder than these words. I glanced around the room, noticing every detail. The furniture arrangement she proudly showed me, the perfectly placed decorations, the photos on the wall, the toys neatly stored in corners. All of it bore her mark now, her rules, her vision. And yet, in every corner, I saw opportunity, small, subtle ways to show my presence mattered without breaking their imposed boundaries. I felt a twinge of irony. Here she was, trying to control every move, dictating every action, and yet she had no idea that quiet observation can be more powerful than confrontation. Every rule she imposed was a challenge, a map guiding me to the moment when I could act, not with aggression, but with precision. I leaned back, keeping my composure, and thought to myself, they want me quiet. They want me to fade into the background. Fine, but I will not disappear. I will not be dismissed. And one day, they will understand. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. And in that silence, a plan began to take shape in my mind. Not loud, not flashy, not obvious, but a plan that would quietly assert that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. And in that quiet, stunned moment, I realized something crucial. Sometimes the most powerful actions are those that begin silently when no one is watching and bloom fully only when the world least expects it. As my daughter continued outlining her rules, I nodded politely, taking in each restriction, each don't, each limit imposed. Inside, I was hurt, but my resolve hardened. I would follow the rules for now, but I would also find a way to make them see that a mother's love, wisdom, and presence are never truly silent. The plan was forming quietly, and I could already feel the first threads of anticipation winding through my chest. The moment was coming when everything she tried to control would be met with calm, precise, and undeniable presence. And so, with every don't interfere and follow the rules, my determination grew. I may have been told where I could step, but I was already stepping in the most important ways, in my mind, in my heart, and soon, in ways they would never forget. After the shock of the new rules announcement settled like a weight on my shoulders, I realized that reacting impulsively would not help me. The instinct to argue, to raise my voice, to defend my place in the house was strong, almost irresistible, but I knew that aggression would only make me the villain in my own story. I had to resist. I had to remain quiet, composed, patient. I decided then that my strength would not come from confrontation. My power would come from observation, from patience, from the quiet, almost invisible ways I could assert my presence without breaking a single one of their newly imposed rules. It was a delicate balance, a dance that required careful attention to every nuance, every interaction, every glance and word exchanged. In those first hours, I began noticing things I hadn't before. How my daughter arranged the kitchen, everything in perfect order, as if to prove her control. How my son tried to avoid eye contact when I quietly entered the room. How the grandchildren instinctively glanced toward me when decisions were being made, as if seeking an ally, even though they didn't know it yet. These small observations gave me insight into the household dynamics, And I realized that despite the rules, my presence still mattered more than they realized. I started making tiny, deliberate movements, adjusting a chair here, placing a dish on the counter there, small gestures that stayed within the boundaries she had laid out, but subtly reminded everyone that I was still here, that I was still paying attention. I smiled politely at my daughter's rules, nodded at her instructions, and never spoke more than necessary. And yet, each small act was a quiet assertion of awareness, a subtle ripple of influence that they couldn't ignore. The tension in the house was palpable. Every glance I received felt weighted. Every whispered conversation seemed to include a careful mention of my presence. I could sense my daughter's unease growing, the faint flicker of doubt in her eyes when she realized that no amount of rules could erase the history, the experience, or the care I brought into this home. I moved through the rooms with a sense of purpose, quietly cataloging their habits, noting patterns, and observing weaknesses. The way my son hesitated when giving instructions to the children, unsure if I would intervene. The way my daughter carefully monitored herself, trying to maintain control, yet unconsciously inviting my presence into their decisions. Every detail became part of the larger picture I was quietly painting in my mind. By not reacting aggressively, I transformed what could have been a moment of conflict into a moment of strategy. I let them speak, let them impose, let them believe they were in charge, but in doing so, I was learning, understanding, and preparing. There is a strength in silence, I realized, a patience that allows the smallest actions to carry the heaviest weight. As I continued my quiet resistance, I felt a rising anticipation, a growing excitement in my chest. I knew that the time would come when these small, careful observations would converge into a single, undeniable moment of clarity, a moment when my influence, my wisdom, and my presence could no longer be ignored, and I would not have to raise my voice, shout, or break the rules to make it happen. I could feel the subtle shift happening even now. Every time my daughter gave an instruction, I followed it precisely, but with small, thoughtful variations that highlighted the difference experience brings. Every time my son tried to assert authority, I responded with a calm attentiveness that made him pause, reconsider, and recognize that guidance cannot be dismissed, even quietly. The children, too, began to notice. Their eyes lingered on me during conversations. Their little gestures acknowledged my presence in ways they didn't yet understand. It was a reminder that my role as a mother, grandmother, and family matriarch could not be erased by a list of rules. My quiet resistance was not passive. It was purposeful, deliberate, and building toward a crescendo that no one in the house could anticipate. And as the hours passed, the tension grew. I felt it in the stiff postures, the awkward silences, the subtle glances exchanged between my daughter and son. I could sense them wondering how I remained so calm, so composed, so quietly present, despite the boundaries they had drawn. This, I realized, was the true power of quiet resistance, the power to unsettle without confrontation, to assert without aggression, to command attention without making a scene. I began planning the next steps in my mind, knowing that each small action, each observed detail, would feed into the moment when I could assert myself fully, but on my own terms. There was no rush, no need to act prematurely. The foundation of respect and influence was being built quietly, in plain sight, yet invisible to those who underestimated the strength of patience, observation, and subtle action. By the time I sat quietly in the living room, sipping my tea, I felt a sense of satisfaction growing alongside the tension. I had not defied them openly. I had not caused a scene. And yet, the house already felt different. The dynamics had shifted imperceptibly, subtly, in ways that only I could fully appreciate. Every rule they imposed became a framework within which I could operate, a map guiding me toward the moment when my quiet presence would speak louder than words. The anticipation was electric. Every creak of the floorboards, every muffled conversation, every glance shared between family members reminded me that I was not invisible, that I had not been dismissed, and that my quiet resistance was already having an impact. And I knew deep in my heart that the moment for my move, the moment for the quiet assertion of dignity, respect, and subtle triumph, was drawing closer with each passing hour. By remaining calm, observant, and deliberate, I had transformed what could have been a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for strategy. And as the sun cast long shadows across the living room that afternoon, I smiled to myself, quietly confident that patience, awareness, and subtle action would yield results far beyond what any loud confrontation ever could. I had planted the seeds of quiet resistance. Now, all that remained was to let them grow. As the days passed, I settled into my quiet role within the house, following the rules to the letter while keeping my mind wide open. My presence was calm, subdued, almost invisible on the surface, but inside I was observing everything. Every conversation, every glance, every action became a thread in the tapestry of the household. I had chosen quiet resistance, yes, but observation was my true weapon. I watched how my daughter managed her perfect household, and I noticed cracks almost immediately. She prided herself on controlling every little detail, on enforcing her rules with precision. But no plan is flawless, and everyone makes mistakes, even those who believe themselves infallible. She would organize the kitchen meticulously, ensuring every dish, utensil, and spice had a perfect place. But I noticed that she overlooked the smaller details, like leaving the pantry door slightly ajar, or misplacing a can of soup in a cupboard she swore she had organized. Tiny things, insignificant to most, but to me, they were signs that perfection was an illusion. I watched my son, too, as he moved through the house, trying to assert authority without upsetting my daughter. He followed the rules, but hesitated at every turn, second-guessing himself, unsure whether my calm presence was approval or scrutiny. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I caught the hesitation in his movements, the slight pause in his voice, the micro-expressions that betrayed uncertainty. Even the grandchildren played into these cracks without realizing it. One moment, a toy was out of place, a chair slightly off-kilter. Another, a spilled drink went unnoticed for a few moments. These were small disturbances, tiny deviations from order, but they revealed that no matter how strict the rules, life cannot be perfectly controlled. And in those moments, I realized that subtle mistakes can create openings. I observed interactions between my daughter and son, noting where they disagreed or failed to communicate effectively. Arguments erupted over trivial matters: where to store a new set of dishes, how to schedule a household chore, who was responsible for which task. My daughter would insist on one method, my son would quietly resist, and in the tension of their disagreements, I saw opportunities. Every dispute, every misstep was a chance for me to quietly influence the outcome without stepping beyond the boundaries they had imposed. Even their scheduling of the children revealed weaknesses. There were overlapping responsibilities, miscommunications about activities, and moments when neither parent knew what the other had decided. I noted every inconsistency, every point of friction, every hesitation. And as I observed, I began mentally marking these moments as points of leverage, places where a calm, thoughtful intervention could shift dynamics, restore balance, or even subtly assert my presence without violating their rules. What fascinated me most was their confidence. They believed that the rules and structures they created made them untouchable, that their household was impervious to influence. And yet, every small mistake, every lapse, every overlooked detail whispered a different story. It told me that control is never absolute, that respect cannot be demanded, and that true influence comes from awareness, timing, and precision. I began testing the waters with small, deliberate actions. Nothing obvious, nothing that broke the rules. A slight adjustment to a misplaced object, a careful word at the right moment when a minor disagreement arose, a quiet suggestion phrased as a question, never a directive. Each small act revealed more about their reactions, their patience, and their limitations. I noticed patterns. My daughter would become impatient when she felt others were encroaching, yet she often overcorrected, leaving openings for subtle influence. My son would comply outwardly, but would falter internally, unsure if he had made the correct choice. The children instinctively sought guidance when confusion arose, and my calm presence became an unspoken anchor. It became clear, mistakes are rarely catastrophic. They are opportunities, small cracks, tiny inconsistencies, little weaknesses. These were the exact points where influence could quietly grow, where respect could be earned, where subtle, strategic actions could make the biggest impact. And in every observation, my plan grew sharper, more precise. I began plotting, in my mind, how each error could be leveraged. I imagined the sequence of moments, a minor correction here, a gentle word there, a quiet but deliberate action at just the right time. Each mistake they made became a stepping stone, a silent path toward the moment when my presence could no longer be ignored. There was a thrill in this awareness, a quiet satisfaction that, despite the rules and restrictions imposed upon me, I was not powerless. My patience, my attentiveness, my understanding of the house and the people within it, these were my tools, my strategy, my quiet rebellion. Every mistake they made was a key. Every lapse a door waiting to be opened. I didn't act immediately. That was not the point. I let the tension build, let the errors accumulate, let the subtle chaos of human imperfection reveal itself. And as I sat quietly, observing, cataloging, mentally preparing, I felt the anticipation grow. Every moment, every detail, every slight hesitation in their behavior was another thread weaving the tapestry of my quiet but inevitable influence. By the end of the day, it was clear to me their rules could limit my movements, restrict my words, and dictate appearances, but they could not control awareness, patience, or foresight. And in that quiet, knowing observation, I recognized the first real advantage I had gained since the rules were imposed: knowledge. Knowledge of their patterns, knowledge of their weaknesses, knowledge of the small mistakes that would allow me to act strategically, with precision, and without confrontation. The quiet resistance of Chapter 2 had evolved into something sharper, something more deliberate, a plan informed by the mistakes of those who believed they were in control. And as I prepared to move from observation to subtle action, I could feel the tension in the house, the unspoken unease growing. They did not yet know it, but the foundation of my influence was already being laid, brick by brick, mistake by mistake, observation by observation. Quietly, I smiled to myself. They believed they were in charge. They believed the rules kept me in check. But every error, every inconsistency, every overlooked detail was a step closer to the moment when my presence would be undeniable, when respect would be restored, and when quiet patience would prove more powerful than any shouted argument. In the stillness of that evening, as the house settled and the day's activity faded, I knew one thing with certainty. Mistakes, small as they might be, were the very tools I needed to quietly turn the tables, and I was ready to begin. After days of quiet observation, watching mistakes, noting hesitations, and cataloging weaknesses, I finally allowed myself to think about the next step. Not the step of confrontation, not a loud argument or impulsive act, but a deliberate, quiet response that would leave an impact far greater than any raised voice could. I understood, finally, that the greatest power comes not from being heard in the moment, but from being remembered afterward. I sat in the living room that evening, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background, the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen, and began to run scenarios through my mind. Each one had to be precise, subtle, and undeniable in its effect. There could be no mistakes. There could be no chance of misinterpretation. This was not revenge born of anger. It was strategy born of patience, intelligence, and dignity. I thought about the rules my daughter had imposed, the rules that were meant to keep me in check. They became, in my mind, the framework for the plan. Every limitation was a guideline, every restriction a tool. How could I work within them, comply without submission, and influence without confrontation? That question became my focus. I considered small gestures that would be noticed, that would linger in their minds long after the day ended. A simple adjustment here, a thoughtful placement there, a perfectly timed comment that seemed casual but carried weight. Each action would appear innocent, respectful, compliant, but beneath the surface, it would be deliberate and pointed. I recalled the weaknesses I had observed, my daughter's overconfidence in controlling every detail, my son's hesitation under scrutiny, the children's instinctive look toward me for guidance when decisions wavered. Each weakness was a lever I could use. My plan began to take shape, quiet but powerful, a series of small actions that together would create a moment impossible to ignore. I began preparing physical props, things that would be subtle yet meaningful. A carefully folded blanket placed just so in the living room, a family heirloom displayed with casual elegance on the mantel, a dessert I had prepared earlier that hinted at my presence, thoughtfulness, and taste. Each object would communicate something my words could not, that my place in the household could not be erased, that respect could not be demanded, and that presence, attention, and care matter far more than arbitrary rules. In my mind, I rehearsed the timing, the sequence of actions, the subtle interactions I would use to guide attention without overt interference. It was like composing a symphony. Every note, every pause, every movement had to be intentional, each feeding into the crescendo that would ultimately deliver the payoff. I considered the reactions I might provoke, imagining their surprise, their hesitation, their recognition of a force they had underestimated. I did not desire shame or guilt. Those were cheap victories. What I wanted was acknowledgement, a quiet understanding that my presence mattered, that my dignity could not be dismissed, that my patience and observation had borne fruit. As I meticulously planned, I realized something profound. The rules they had imposed were not obstacles, they were opportunities. Every restriction could be turned into a stage, every limit into a subtle leverage point. The very act of compliance, executed with thoughtfulness and precision, could become a statement far louder than defiance. I set out each prop carefully, envisioning the moment it would catch attention. The dessert, prepared with care and placed in the perfect spot, would not simply be food. It would be a symbol, a statement of elegance, patience, and presence. The heirloom, casually displayed, would evoke history, tradition, and continuity. The small adjustments to furniture, decorations, and everyday objects would quietly assert observation, intelligence, and subtle guidance. Foreshadowing the payoff, I imagined their reactions, a flicker of recognition in my daughter's eyes, a brief hesitation in my son's voice, the children glancing at me knowingly, even if they didn't understand why. I wanted that moment to be unforgettable, to be quiet yet unforgettable, like the slow crescendo of a song that suddenly commands full attention. I knew that timing was everything. I could not rush. Each step had to unfold naturally, organically, in a way that seemed accidental, inevitable, and entirely respectful. And yet, beneath the surface, it would be a carefully choreographed out demonstration of awareness, patience, and presence. As I sat back and surveyed the small adjustments, the props, the mental notes, I felt a quiet thrill. This was no longer about being hurt, about being dismissed, about rules or limitations. This was about mastery, control of the moment through intelligence and subtlety, and creating a lasting impression that demanded recognition without a single raised voice. I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that the stage was set, the props were in place, and the plan was complete. All that remained was execution. And when that moment came, they would see something they had forgotten. The true influence is not about forcing attention or demanding respect. It is about orchestrating moments so carefully, so deliberately, that the acknowledgement of your presence becomes inevitable. For now, I would remain calm, patient, and quiet, letting the tension build. The anticipation in the household, though unspoken, was palpable. They did not yet know it, but the scene was set, the threads woven, and the moment of quiet yet undeniable impact was approaching. The rules they had imposed would serve as the canvas on which I would paint a moment of dignity, intelligence, and subtle triumph that none of them could ignore. I closed my eyes briefly, imagining the payoff, the slight pause of surprise, the subtle recognition of thoughtfulness, the quiet acknowledgement of presence. It would not be dramatic or loud. It would be remembered precisely because it was understated, deliberate, and perfectly executed. And that, I realized, was the true beauty of quiet strategy. It never shouts, yet it is unforgettable. The plan was set. The props were ready. The timing was in my mind. And as I prepared to take the next steps, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. Patience, observation, and subtle action were about to converge, and the moment of quiet, undeniable influence would arrive soon, shocking them not with loud defiance, but with poised, measured, and unforgettable presence. The day arrived when all of the quiet planning, the careful observation, and the patience I had cultivated began to take form. I had rehearsed the moments in my mind countless times, imagining each gesture, each placement, each subtle action that would carry more weight than words ever could. And now it was time. I moved through the house with calm assurance, each step measured, deliberate. The air felt different, charged with an invisible tension. I was not loud. I did not announce my intentions. I simply acted, knowing that every small detail had been considered, every subtle interaction planned. The rules imposed on me became my framework, guiding me as I executed my plan with precision and dignity. I started with the living room. The chairs, slightly misaligned, were quietly adjusted. Not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but just enough to show attentiveness, thoughtfulness, and awareness. I arranged a small stack of family photos, subtly positioning the most meaningful ones where they would catch the light, drawing attention to the lineage, the history, and the love that could not be erased. Next, the kitchen. The dessert I had prepared earlier, simple yet elegant, crafted with care, was placed in the center of the table. It was a quiet statement, an offering, a demonstration that my presence brought more than mere compliance. It brought thought, attention, and effort. As I stepped back to admire the arrangement, I noticed the first reactions. My daughter's eyes flicked toward the table, a brief pause, a subtle widening. My son's brow lifted, an almost imperceptible shock crossing his face. Even the grandchildren glanced up, curious, sensing that something was different, something deliberate. I moved slowly, ensuring every gesture was understated. A careful placement here, a subtle adjustment there, each action respecting the rules while carrying the weight of intention. I did not speak. I allowed the house itself to reflect my presence. The careful thought behind each movement, became the language through which I communicated, a quiet yet unmistakable message. I am here, I am observant, and I matter. As I passed through the hallway, I noticed the small but telling reactions. My daughter's lips pressed into a line, her attempt to mask surprise failing for just a moment. My son's eyes lingered slightly longer than necessary on my hands, as if realizing that my attention to detail had not gone unnoticed. And the grandchildren, in their innocent curiosity, began to look toward me for guidance, subtly acknowledging my influence without understanding its full weight. Even the smallest actions carried impact. A folded blanket on the couch, a perfectly aligned cushion, a strategically placed book, all spoke of care, intelligence, and presence. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but those who had imposed the rules, who thought they could dictate my involvement, felt it immediately. A quiet disturbance, a realization that control is never absolute, rippled through the household. I observed their reactions carefully. Each flicker of recognition, each tiny pause, each moment of hesitation reinforced the subtle power of my approach. I did not need to speak. The house itself, shaped by my actions, conveyed the message. Dignity, cleverness, and quiet influence became visible in the smallest details, and the effect was immediate. My daughter's glance met mine briefly, a flash of uncertainty crossing her face. She tried to appear composed, to mask any recognition of the statement I had just made through simple actions, but I could see the momentary disruption in her confidence. My son, ever cautious, paused mid-task, suddenly aware that my calm presence had shifted the dynamics of the house. Even the children's playful chatter fell slightly quiet as they noticed the changes, subtle as they were, and instinctively acknowledged my attentiveness. It was in that moment I realized the power of understated action. There was no need for drama, no need for confrontation, no need to raise my voice or challenge them overtly. The clever execution of thoughtfulness and precision carried far more weight than any argument could. Every placement, every adjustment, every quiet action spoke of intelligence, awareness, and dignity, and they could not ignore it. I continued through the house, maintaining the same approach. Every interaction, every glance, every subtle adjustment reinforced my presence. I smiled politely when spoken to, responded calmly, and allowed the house itself to narrate my involvement. Each reaction I observed, small shocks, subtle stares, fleeting moments of surprise, was a confirmation that my plan was working. And yet, I remained composed, dignified. I did not rush, did not exaggerate, did not seek to humiliate. This was not revenge in the childish sense. It was quiet, strategic, and precise. It was about showing that respect cannot be demanded, that control cannot erase presence, and that intelligence paired with patience creates an impact far more profound than confrontation ever could. By the end of that day, the subtle payback had begun. The house, subtly influenced by my careful actions, reflected a presence that could not be ignored. My daughter's confidence, though outwardly intact, had a tiny fissure. My son's composure had a slight hesitation. The children instinctively looked toward me more often, seeking guidance and comfort. The message was clear. Though they had tried to define boundaries, control actions, and restrict involvement, the quiet, intelligent presence of a mother could not be contained, and as I sat quietly that evening, observing the subtle shifts, I felt the calm satisfaction of execution. The plan was working, the payoff was beginning, and it would grow, slowly but undeniably, until every rule, every restriction, every attempt to control my presence would be met with the quiet force of dignity, cleverness, and subtle authority. No loud words were needed. No dramatic gestures were required. The house itself had become my stage, my actions the performance, and their reactions the proof. Subtle payback, executed with intelligence and grace, was far more satisfying than any confrontation could ever be, and I knew, deep in my heart, that the next chapters would bring the crescendo, the moment when respect, recognition, and quiet triumph would be undeniable. I remember the moment it happened, the exact instant my family began to understand what I had done, not with a shout, not with confrontation, but with a quiet, unmistakable shift in awareness that spread slowly across the room like the first rays of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It began with my daughter. She paused mid-action, her hands stilling over the dishes she was stacking. Her eyes flicked toward the table, toward the subtle adjustments I had made, the dessert carefully positioned, the heirloom laid out in perfect prominence, the living room subtly realigned. Her lips pressed together, and I could see the faint catch in her breath, a recognition, sudden and undeniable. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of the grandchildren playing in the corner. My daughter looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't expected, a mix of surprise, admiration, and yes, a twinge of guilt. She realized, perhaps for the first time since she had laid down her rules, that control is not everything, that presence cannot be erased, and that a mother's quiet influence is a force to be reckoned with. My son's reaction came next. He had been moving through the kitchen, pretending not to notice the subtle changes I had implemented. But his hesitation told a different story. He stopped, glanced around, and finally met my eyes. There was a flicker of acknowledgement there, a silent admission that my careful, deliberate actions had shifted the balance in ways they had not anticipated. He understood, finally, that presence, patience, and intelligence can speak louder than words or confrontation ever could. Even the grandchildren seemed to sense the change. Their play slowed, their little eyes observing me with a curiosity that reflected instinctively that something was different, that something deliberate and important had occurred. They didn't know why, of course, but they understood, in their own way, that I had made my presence felt without breaking a single rule, without raising my voice, without causing a scene. I allowed the moment to unfold slowly, savoring the subtle shock in their expressions. I did not need to explain myself. I did not need to justify my actions. Everything I had done, the quiet gestures, the careful placement, the understated adjustments, spoke for themselves. And in that silent recognition, I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. This was the power of quiet assertiveness, to influence, to guide, and to command respect without aggression, without shouting, without demanding attention. My daughter finally spoke, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Mom, I didn't realize. I didn't understand how much thought you put into everything." There was an honesty there, a vulnerability, a recognition of something she had overlooked in her haste to impose rules. In that moment, I felt the emotional weight of years of patience, observation, and careful planning paying off, not as revenge, but as undeniable proof that respect cannot be dismissed. I smiled, keeping my tone calm and gentle. "It wasn't about proving anything," I said. "It was about showing that presence matters, thoughtfulness matters, dignity matters." Her eyes met mine, wide and reflective, as she slowly nodded. I could sense a shift in her understanding, a dawning appreciation for the quiet, deliberate influence I had exercised. As the realization spread, I noticed subtle shifts in the room. My son relaxed slightly, no longer hesitant, now aware that my calm presence had shaped the household in a way that rules could not control. The grandchildren, sensing the change, glanced toward me more frequently, a silent acknowledgement of guidance and support. And my daughter, still processing, seemed to understand that authority is not just about enforcing rules. It is about awareness, patience, and the ability to act thoughtfully when it matters most. In that moment, I reflected on the power of quiet assertiveness. It is not about shouting louder than anyone else. It is not about forcing respect through fear or anger. It is about patience, observation, and the deliberate, thoughtful execution of influence. It is about knowing when to act, how to act, and letting the impact speak for itself. I realized, too, that this quiet power is not just a strategy. It is a reflection of dignity. Acting with composure, intelligence, and subtlety commands attention in a way that no argument ever could. It leaves a lasting impression precisely because it is unexpected, understated, and deliberate. As I watched my daughter slowly absorb the lesson, a sense of calm pride settled over me. I had achieved what confrontation could never have done: acknowledgement without resentment, respect without conflict, influence without overstepping boundaries. The rules, which had once felt like chains, had become the framework for a display of quiet power and thoughtful presence that they could not ignore. Even after the initial shock faded, I could see the subtle shifts that lingered. The occasional glance toward me for guidance, the brief pause in conversation when a decision was made, the unspoken recognition that my presence carried weight. It was subtle, yes, but it was undeniable, and in that moment, I understood fully that true assertiveness does not always require noise or drama. Sometimes it is in the quiet, patient, deliberate actions that the deepest impact is made. Respect earned this way is lasting because it cannot be demanded. It must be observed, understood, and acknowledged. I sat back quietly, allowing the moment to settle, savoring the awareness that my strategy had worked. The family had realized what had happened, not because I forced them to, but because I had allowed the power of subtle, dignified, and clever action to do the work for me. And in that quiet victory, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The realization was complete. Respect had been restored, presence had been acknowledged, and the lessons of patience, thoughtfulness, and quiet influence had been etched into the household in a way that would not soon be forgotten. The payoff, long anticipated, had arrived, and it was more powerful, more elegant, and more lasting than any loud confrontation ever could have been. The moment I had been waiting for arrived, not with a shout, not with a dramatic confrontation, but quietly, subtly, like the turning of a tide that had been building for days. The house, once filled with tension and rules designed to constrain me, now seemed to breathe differently. I could feel it. The shift that had been forming slowly, imperceptibly, was now undeniable. It began in the living room, with my daughter glancing toward me as she rearranged a chair. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time since the announcement of her new rules, I saw recognition there, realization, a subtle acknowledgement that the quiet, deliberate actions I had taken were not accidental, not passive, but purposeful. Respect, long withheld by the imposition of authority, had finally been earned. I watched the expressions on my son's face as he paused mid-task, the smallest flicker of hesitation giving way to acknowledgement. He understood, silently and without words, that my presence carried weight, that my thoughtfulness and patience had shifted the dynamics of the household in a way no rules, no arguments, no assertions of control could. Even the children, innocent witnesses to the subtle orchestration of the day, responded differently. They glanced toward me in small, instinctive gestures of recognition and respect, unaware of the full depth of the strategy I had employed, yet instinctively sensing its influence. Their awareness, subtle though it was, reinforced what I had long known. Influence earned quietly, thoughtfully, and with dignity carries more power than any loud declaration ever could. As I moved through the house that day, placing small gestures and finishing subtle adjustments, I felt an internal calm settle over me. It was a satisfaction unlike any other, a deep, quiet relief born of patience, perseverance, and the knowledge that I had achieved what confrontation could never have done. The house no longer felt tense with unspoken rules. It hummed with subtle acknowledgement, the quiet energy of respect earned through intelligence and deliberate presence. I reflected on each small action that had led to this moment: the careful placement of the dessert, the subtle arrangement of furniture, the understated gestures of attention and thoughtfulness. All of it had contributed to the shift. Each small act, though unnoticed at the time by some, had combined to create a crescendo of recognition, a moment of undeniable influence. And yet, the beauty of it was that it had been achieved without conflict. No harsh words, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, only quiet, deliberate presence, only patience, observation, and thoughtful action. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the lesson had been delivered without humiliation, without anger, and without resentment. Respect had been restored, not through force, but through careful orchestration, intelligence, and dignity. I could see it in my daughter's eyes, the flicker of guilt quickly tempered by admiration. She recognized finally that attempting to erase my influence through rules had failed, and that respect, once earned through patience and quiet authority, cannot be ignored. My son's subtle nod, my quiet smile in response, and the children's attentive glances reinforced the truth I had long known. Influence is measured not by volume, but by presence, patience, and wisdom. In the quiet of that moment, I reflected on my own feelings. Relief, yes, for the tension that had been building for days had finally eased. Satisfaction, certainly, for my careful strategy had worked exactly as I had envisioned. But above all, pride, a calm, unshakable pride in the power of quiet dignity, in the elegance of patience, and in the satisfaction of achieving lasting impact without creating conflict. I realized, too, that this moment was more than just personal triumph. It was a reminder of a principle I had always believed, that quiet action, careful thought, and deliberate influence often speak louder than words, louder than arguments, louder than attempts to assert authority through fear or force. The respect I had earned was not fragile or fleeting. It was real, earned in a way that would linger far longer than any momentary confrontation ever could. As I looked around the room, I noticed the subtle signs of acknowledgement all around me. A glance here, a pause there, a careful smile shared between my daughter and son when they noticed my quiet adjustments. Every small, understated gesture of recognition reinforced the moment of triumph I had orchestrated. It was complete, it was undeniable, and it was mine. In that moment, I allowed myself to fully feel the depth of the achievement, the planning, the observation, the patience, the subtle execution. All of it had culminated in a quiet, lasting triumph. I felt a calm satisfaction, a serene joy, and a renewed understanding of the power inherent in dignity, patience, and quiet influence. I could see clearly now that confrontation is rarely necessary when wisdom, patience, and subtle action are applied strategically. Loud voices can demand attention, but they rarely command respect. True influence, the kind that endures, grows quietly, thoughtfully, and deliberately. And in this house, in this moment, I had demonstrated exactly that. As the evening settled in, I moved with calm assurance, knowing that the house, once tense and ruled by arbitrary restrictions, now resonated with quiet acknowledgement of my presence. The respect that had long been withheld was finally restored, and it came not as a result of force, but through patience, intelligence, and dignity. I smiled quietly to myself, fully aware that this moment of triumph would linger far longer than any argument or confrontation ever could. It was a reminder and a lesson that quiet dignity, calm, thoughtful, strategic, can achieve far more than anger or aggression. And in that serene satisfaction, I knew one truth. Influence is not given, it is earned, and it is most powerful when it arrives quietly, deliberately, and with elegance. I had reached the moment of triumph, and it was everything I had hoped for: silent, dignified, undeniable, and unforgettable. I gathered my things slowly, deliberately, savoring the calm that had finally settled over the house. Every glance, every subtle acknowledgement from my daughter and son, every quiet recognition from the grandchildren felt like a confirmation that patience, observation, and quiet strategy had worked. As I walked toward the door, I held my head high. No resentment weighed me down. No anger tugged at my shoulders. Only the serene satisfaction of dignity restored. The house, once rigid with rules and unspoken tension, now carried the silent testimony of influence earned through thoughtfulness, intelligence, and subtle action. My steps were measured, unhurried, each movement a reflection of confidence and calm. I glanced back once, not with bitterness, but with a quiet sense of triumph. They had tried to impose boundaries, to control the rhythm of my presence, but the reality was clear. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be demonstrated, observed, and earned. And in that moment it had been. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, freer, filled with the promise of a lesson carried quietly but deeply into the hearts of those I loved. I paused for a moment, letting the significance of the journey settle over me. Life has a way of testing patience, of challenging dignity, but I had discovered that the most powerful responses are those measured with care, strategy, and unwavering calm. And as I closed the door behind me, I whispered to myself, a smile tugging at my lips. They wanted me quiet, but at dessert I served more than sweetness. I served respect. It was a moment of quiet victory, a reflection of the lessons learned, that patience, dignity, and strategic action can achieve far more than confrontation ever could. That presence, carefully exercised, is a force that cannot be ignored, and that sometimes the greatest power lies in subtlety, grace, and the unwavering confidence to act thoughtfully, even when others attempt to silence you. Walking away, I felt the strength of that truth in every step.